I'm learning a ton and enjoying it a lot. So reading books
Uh,
about investment pitching and stuff
didn't you
instead
send me
of
a book on investment pitching too? You sent me one.
I sent you uh just some the
Full screen.
yeah what was it called? It was called Pitch Anything, and it's kind of a modern book on rhetoric in business, but that's not what he calls it. It it's a book about uh, how it is that people think about taking risks and how to basically talk about risk in a modern business setting, or how to frame relationships to help people um, not feel simple risk, but understand reward and risk and the relationship between the two. It was really, I mean, a super interesting book, and um, it it he's got a whole thing about frame. Uh, what does he call it? Frame social framing.
Mm.
Um, but it's basically how do you decide which of you is the expert in the scenario, which of you should be the one leading a conversation, and it comes down to sort of how the two social frames come into contact and which one eats up the other. So which one has a social frame that can subsume both of you, and which one has a social frame that is the smaller of the two. And that stuff I found fascinating.
What?
It
Are
so
you
it,
serious? Like
yeah.
that's inside this selling book?
Inside this, yeah. And I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is the frame narrative stuff, and that's what I sent you. I said, dude, I think it was chapter 2. I was like, chapter 2 is all the stuff we've been talking about with frame narrative. And he basically comes in and he says, how do you know and communicate your frame in a social setting? And it's kind of a how-to book, but it was really, really interesting. And he
So
talks
can
a bunch about the importance of just humor and joviality, magnanimity, which those aren't the words he uses, but those are the words that Aristotle uses when talking about the same thing. So that there's this way of interacting in which you go in saying, "Hey, we can both win here," right? Magnanimity, and the way that you communicate that is joviality, by just having a lighter, less cynical framework that that even if we're at odds, we don't have to be enemies. That kind of mentality.
Hmm.
And he said that's how you have a larger framework, a larger frame narrative than the person in front of you. If the person in front of you only can see like this particular conflict in this moment, or that we're trying to defeat one another in this situation or something. He said there's a way to. He said the alpha is basically the one with the largest frame narrative that can fit this all to a jovial context, and it was really interesting stuff. A
That's
lot
like
of stuff
right where
about
we've been at. Yeah, that's just right where we've been living at
what's
and talking
it,
about.
right. And what's so interesting is, he tries to ground it in like evolutionary brain science,
Oh
but it's
wow.
really, you can tell that it's stuff he's experienced, and then he's trying to backfill. How can I explain this in a scientific sounding way so that people will believe me? Because science is the authority in our day. Brain science is so new. We know so little. I mean, the only thing we probably know less about than the brain is the intestines.
Ocean. It's funny is the part of the thing that I've started reading Lewis, which by the way, Lewis in the world that I grew up in, kind of first you got the charismatic world that wasn't really involved in Lewis, but then I moved into the more kind of Reformed Baptist kind of world. Christian Missionary Alliance. I gotta say, they loved Lewis. Like Mere Christianity loved Lewis, but
Yeah.
then that more reformed side of it wasn't really a huge fan of Lewis. But the more that I've come to understand and really read Lewis, he makes so much sense of the world that it's made me understand that Christianity is the only way to see the world, in which that we actually have space for people who aren't Christian. I guess it's there's no other way to
Right.
see the world. Otherwise, we look like Islam, right? You know, that's or we look like the social justice movement is looking right now,
Right. Right.
right? Or
That
or
that that,
current,
that conform or else. Um,
right?
yeah.
But Christianity is the only way to see the world where we have, like you said, that overarching narrative of how the world really is made and how it operates, and how, in one sense or another, it is. Um, I don't want to use the word inclusive because I don't want it to be taken out of context, but inclusive, right? Where we can actually, because here's one thing, right now we're having a conversation in politics on is there a place for us in the world, in this new world that's being created by social justice movement, by the new
Right.
world order? Like no one's even acting like that stuff doesn't exist anymore. We all know that it's happening, and we know there's a recreation of the world that's happening right in front of us. Everybody knows that.
Right.
And the question that everybody is asking is who's out and who's in and who's in
Right.
charge, right? Because it's like this new covenant that's being made with people, right?
Yeah.
And right now people are fighting over, like, well, if they get it, we're out, we're not in. But I don't think that we've made a compelling argument that Christianity is the only way to see the world, in which people who are not Christians get to still live in this world in relationship with other human beings without feeling like that they are out. You know what I mean? Or second class citizens in some way, right? Or not even citizens at all, the way that's going.
Right. Well, because non, if you don't have a Christian view of the cosmos, then you end up like Mao, killing millions of people, because you have to build, you have to basically cut out the parts of the world that don't conform, because it's because there's not a spot for them, because you've got to, if God is not in control, then you have to be. Right? So you have, and the parts that won't come under your control, you have to either coerce into your power, or you have to manipulate into your power, or you have to get rid of. Right. And this is why you've got the mass murders of the 20th century. I mean, you've got a whole list of mass murderers that, for whatever reason, people just don't even talk about anymore. We think, well, we're so much more, we're so much further along. We would never do that, or we would never commit these sort of mass murderers. We remember Hitler for some reason, but we have a hard time remembering Stalin and Mao, Pol Pot, the other mass murderers. Every single one of them, it was about saying this world is out of control unless somebody applies enough force, and I'm going to be the one that does it. And so they use the centralized government to apply enough force to keep the world in control. But it's not the kind of world that we can control. I mean, Ecclesiastes is all about that. It's out of our control. We have limitations, and the embrace of our limitations is a joy in a Christian worldview, in a Christian understanding for Christians, to say, you know what, I've got my limitations. I don't have to be God. There's already a God on the throne. And so I get to actually just live my little life, enjoy it, love the people God puts in front of me. And I don't have to be in control. And this goes all the way up on the political side, but then we do it on our, in our families. Anytime you feel like I've got to manipulate my spouse into doing this thing, whether it's, just guilt manipulation, emotional manipulation, fear tactics, whatever it is. We are basically saying, I've got to control this place because I can't get the blessings unless I'm in control. But God says it's the other way around. He's in control. Be faithful to me. Come trust me, and the blessings flow out of that. We don't coerce our way into blessings. We obey and enjoy our way into blessings.
I know we're supposed to be talking about Dante because I'll get there, but I have to. Yeah, okay. So this is me going to vent a little bit about just so I am I'm looking around my house and I'm seeing things that aren't like gratuitous. There's nothing that's wrong, like really big things that are out of place. I'm just seeing little things that I'm like,
yeah,
didn't I tell my kids to do this? Like, I know I told them to do this. I know I told them to do this thing. They're not doing this thing. And I'm finding that it's everywhere. Like, shoes aren't put where they're supposed to be put. And they're just somewhere in the living room. I told you to put your shoes away. You're not going to find them later. And there's just little things that clean up. They don't clean up where they're supposed to. I come back and it's like halfway done and it's moving on. And I'm finding these little things and it's starting to hit me in a very real way that these are, I'm bringing this up to the point that you're saying about trying to control, right? So I'm looking at these and I'm like, man, these are little foxes, little things of just simple obedience that I'm seeing that I'm like, they're not obeying right away,
right,
all the way with a good attitude every day, right? And so I'm looking at this and I'm like, I got a problem here. And I think before I would have looked at that and been like, I need to tighten down the hatch, right? We're going to screw this thing down. We're going to get it, right? Like I'm going to be on top of everybody making a mistake, And it hit me, this has been something in the work that there is a problem with me being a good Lord of my home, right? Like there is something that I am missing and not communicating well in the love of obedience, in the joy of obedience, and the fruit of obedience.
right.
So that my kids are finding more pleasure in obeying all the way than they would be in just going through the motions and halfway getting it done. And so I'm realizing that there is a relationship thing that I am missing in communicating with my kids about the type of house that we have, about the type of relationship that we have, and about the type of responsibilities that we have to maintain or to continue in that fruitful relationship. And so I look at them and it hit me that I am the person responsible for that. And it seems so simple, like, oh, these are just shoes on the floor. Or this is just not wiping down the counter, or this isn't just sweeping the floor after you know what your duties are. But there's something that I have failed to communicate well and joyfully in my home that has the fruit of that kind of communication to my kids, that they interact with the rest of everything else in the house that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And when we look at ourselves, we know how easy it is to get distracted, to slip out of the little habits. And you guys just moved too, right? So
yeah, right. We just moved into a whole new house.
Whole nother layer.
Yeah, liturgy isn't there yet.
of new sets of habits, new everything. But I also think, like, if you're trying to build into the habits a particular way of thinking about their own motivations as well, and that's where trying to try you want the smile of their mother to be more motivating for them than anything else, right? Like just the joy they bring their mom when she walks in and sees all the shoes in line. You want that to be such a deep motivation that when they forget to put their shoes down, it's not like, dad's asking me to put the shoes away. It's like, oh man,
This will
you're
give me a
right.
spanking. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and um the teach, train, enforce of us of spanking is good for the sorts of things that cause pain in your life down the road, right? You want reality to be, you want your home to reflect reality, and there are certain things that if you live that way out in the world, there's long-term pain, and you want short, quick teaching pain in your home that teaches them about the long-term pain. But the beauty of fellowship, the beauty of a smiling mom, the beauty of a household that's clean and well ordered, and a place where you can actually enjoy one another, is actually the long-term goal, because that's what they're going to take with them. You want them to go out and establish a house that starts there and then builds on it, right? So that it starts with the expectation of fellowship because they have enjoyed it. I mean, this is one of the things that's so hard for a lot of folks, is they've lived out of fellowship for so long that it feels normal. Right. They've lived in the mess, the personal mess, so long that it feels normal. But it's not, right. It's like having a zombie wander around the house constantly, right? If it's there long enough, you get used to it, but it's not supposed to be there, right? But that's the living out of fellowship part, and the only way back into fellowship is forgiveness, right? And because sin is the thing that breaks fellowship, and forgiveness is the thing that overcomes it. And that's something you can only become a forgiving person because you have stopped looking at other people and start looking at what God has done for you, right? When you start responding to God's grace to you by extending that forgiveness outwards, that's the only way back into fellowship. That's a hard transition to make, because fellowship feels terrifying when you've been in a self-protective mode because of sin for so long, right? Fellowship is a horrifying thing. And it's what's so hard. I've seen this a lot of times, right? Folks join the church. They love their church. They're starting to get close to people. They get close enough and they're in fellowship enough that they start sharing things about themselves and their story. They have lived in situations where their weaknesses and their imperfections, their sins, their past failures are used against them. And as soon as they start sharing their past with people, they start feeling unsafe in the church, and they start accusing the church of not being a safe place anymore, because now they don't feel safe. And it really isn't because anything in the church has changed. It's because they don't know how to live in a community where people know you, because they've always lived in coercive and manipulative relationships.
Why are you talking about me? Why you just say Knox? No, you're right about that. You're right. No, you are, and in the place where people use those things against you when it's time.
Right. Yeah. And that's happened to me, right? Like people learn my past. And then, you're in the middle of a situation and you say something and they're like, well, but you did this before, so you can't possibly give good advice in this situation. Right. And you think, okay, that's the kind of person you are, right? You're going to, you know enough about my past to think you can control me. I don't respond to that well. I've listened to too much Rage Against the Machine, and I'm like, thou shalt not manipulate me. That is and I have a lot of patience for a lot of things, but when somebody tries to use and it's something I've trained my kids to do. When my daughter was 10, maybe 11, at one point, she had done something, and I said something that she immediately identified that I was being a manipulative dad. I was using guilt manipulation. And she said, "Dad, you have trained me to not respond to guilt manipulation, so I can't do what you're asking." And that was like my little 11-year-old called me on the carpet, and I was like, "Honey, you're right. That
I'm gonna tell you
was
something.
guilt manipulation. Please forgive me." It's like, I forgive you. Okay, now that I've forgiven you, now that you've forgiven me, let me tell you again without the guilt manipulation what do you need to do, right? Because I was in a position of authority, but I had trained her to identify and reject guilt manipulation. And so even when I went to use it, she was like, "Nope, that's," and so it was, and then that's what you want, right? Because we're not not in charge because we're perfect, right? So you want to train your kids.
I'm gonna tell you something, Jason. I've survived long enough for my, that's what I said. I'm gonna tell you, there would be no knocks. It would be just, "You're done, stud." Like, what did you? Ow! Yeah, I would have been on the ground, bro. So like, even if my kids would do that now, I might even still have that reflex. I'm trying to stop it.
Right,
like,
yeah.
What?
Well, yeah. One of the things that
It's good,
sanctification does is it puts space between your actions and your reactions. You know.
Yeah. Do you think so one of the things that I want to talk about this, I'll probably talk about it more on Cross Politic, but I know you don't have a whole lot of time, and I don't want to waste your time, but there's so much. I try my best not to talk to you until we do a show, but we've been talking a lot this week, and so there's so much here. So I want to talk about Dante. I want to talk about allegory. This is interesting. And so the introduction. Bro, okay, I was looking through translations for Dante, and you told me to get the Dorothy Sayers version. Now, I think you told me to get the Dorothy Sayers version because from what I understand, according to, I just got all the books here, to A Beginner's Guide to Dante's Divine Comedy.
Oh, that one's glorious.
Can we talk to this dude?
Yeah,
he's done
we
C.S.
absolutely
Lewis.
can.
Can we get him on the show? He doesn't even have a Twitter, bro. Jason M. Baxter.
I know. I tried to find him on Twitter to say thank you and couldn't. But I'll start hunting. I'll find him.
Let's get him on the show. I want to talk to him.
So good. His book is so good. And I've just ordered a whole stack of all of his books except for he wrote a dictionary. I think it's a dictionary of Dante, right? So that you could have something sitting there with you. I couldn't afford it. It was like $60 or something. So
go in on it.
I'd totally go in on it. I was thinking of I've just used up this month's book budget. I was going to buy it next month.
And don't let my wife see this. But I think the reason that I got to hide this show from my wife. I think the reason that you wanted me to pick up Dorothy Sayers' version of a translation of Dante was because as I was reading Baxter, he says Dorothy Sayers was the last person to try and translate Dante with his own rhythmic pacing. And so the poetry there, man, it's really brilliant the way he talks about. Okay, I wish I can find this part, but it's brilliant the way he talks about Dante's poem in the sense that Dante creates this other universe for the poetry to live in that you don't even know is going on, but it's happening and you're experiencing one thing. It's what poetry is supposed to do. It holds multiple things up at one time and makes you look at it. And there's one main thing, but then it's this whole nother universe going on around outside of it. And you don't even know until you stop and start breaking it down in a scientific way. And so is that the reason you wanted me to pick up Dorothy Sayers' version of this?
So her poetry still sounds the way the poetry should. It's got the rhythms, it's got the rhyme scheme. And most people don't do it because English the way English has a Germanic grammar system, Italian has a Latin or Romantic grammar system. And so it's easy to rhyme in Latin because the grammar system is all added to the end of the words. And so lots and lots of words rhyme. Our grammar system doesn't function like that. It's a word order grammar system. And so it's much harder to rhyme in English. Dorothy Sayers said, but I'm going to keep the rhyme scheme anyway. Right? So the rhythm and the rhyme scheme, and which is really, really hard, which is why it took her so long. And she didn't quite finish. Somebody finished up the Paradiso for her after she died. But it's because it's hard. But she's brilliant poet. And then the other thing is her notes explaining at the end assume a modern that doesn't know the world of Dante, right? So her notes are not academic. Her notes are readers' notes.
Praise God.
So, and they're at the end, they're at the end of each chapter, so they're easy to.
Is that Sayers' notes?
So those are Sayers' personal notes, right? And so but I love that she wrote readers' notes to help you understand, assuming it was people that didn't have a classical education. So
she's talking about me.
Yeah, so that's why I really love this version, and why I recommend it is because of the notes. If you get something and you're like, I don't quite get it, you can just flip to the end of the chapter and it tells you the line number of the note that explains everything. Sometimes there's something where it was common knowledge in the 60s and it's not anymore. And so there are times when you still do have to look stuff up, but for the most part, she created a reader's copy for people in her day to be able to pick Dante up and read it without having to have a huge dictionary around.
If you can ever make it past the introduction of this one, my goodness, from Penguin Classics, the introduction was enough, like it's huge. So when you were in New York a couple weeks ago, Eric Metaxas show, I think you were out there doing his show, and you were around tour in New York, and I said, so how you doing, man? He's like, hey, I got my copy of Dante, and I'm taking pictures next in Dante's Park, I think it was, right?
Yeah. So I was in the Italian district, and so visiting, so the parks are named after famous Italian poets and musicians, and so I went and went to Dante's Park straight away because I've always wanted to visit, and pulled out my copy of Dante and took a picture of myself with my copy of Dante in front of the statue of Dante in Dante Park.
Because now, what I didn't, because it's what?
Because it's Dante Park, right? It's so none of the New Yorkers even knew it was there. It's like, it was sad to me, but
yeah. So, did you find hell there? I'm just wondering.
No, man, I loved New York. Maybe the subway system would count as something, but I loved the subway. Honestly, you could walk around New York and hear like 9 languages in one day. It was amazing.
Oh, it's I do miss that about cities. Minneapolis is the same way. In the city you can find multiple languages just walking, but New York is absolutely, yeah. But was Dante's Park built like, the first book, Hell? Did it have spiral that went down, or they just call it Dante? Was there anything that resembled Dante in Dante's Park?
It's just like a big triangular spot with a bunch of people sitting, with like tables and trees and everything right in the middle of Manhattan. So they're
What's the point of calling it Dante's Park if it's not going to be like Dante?
Well, because that whole area was founded by Italians, and so they've got
they should know better.
Yeah, they probably should. But I think the goal is, how do we remember our own poetic and musical history as we combine, come into this culture, right? And so they're trying to set up memorials, and
which is more of a reason, though, to say like, okay, you have a name that isn't connected to the art itself. If you want to remember your own culture, don't you have to have the art a part of the name so that people can say, this is us, right?
Yeah.
That's a disconnect.
Probably. Although he wrote a lot besides the Commedia.
But is there anything more popular than this?
No, there isn't. It's an absolute masterpiece, maybe the greatest.
So
arguably the greatest poem outside of scriptures.
So what I didn't know about you was that you actually carry a copy of Dante almost everywhere you go. It's in your bag.
Yeah.
So like
Yep.
Beyonce has hot sauce in her bag, you got Dante.
Yeah. Basically, yeah, I'd carry Dante with me everywhere. So,
Uh, why?
it, well, because uh, it's the way it's like you're walking in you live in a fog, but there's somebody that says, "Let me tell you, here's a map of reality." But it's been sort of fogged out. It isn't impressed onto my imagination, but it was impressed onto the imagination of Dante, and so I'm constantly working with Dante to see my imagination reformed according to reality, or re-sculptured. Or I mean, I like to think of the imagination as, it's like a park. It's the park that you live in. And a lot of the aspects of the modern imagination they've let it grow over, and then it has turned into a desert, because that's actually what happens when you don't if you have a jungle. Just historically speaking, if you have an area and you come in and you clear it out, you build a farm, and then you let it overgrow, it eventually will turn into a desert, right? And that's what happened to the modern imagination. We have very thin imaginations. You listen to something like NPR, and you've got a show called All Things Considered, and all they ever talk about is politics, sometimes economics, but mostly politics, because they're considering all things, right? But we have an imagination that has been thinned down to power structures. Everything is a power structure, and that's all that we believe the world is. So it's chaos and power structures. So, but Dante is really he is a high point in the imaginative construction of in embracing reality and letting reality form the constructs of your imagination, so that you can actually see reality and enjoy it. And so I'm just constantly working through Dante.
So do you think the West ever had a Dantean? Can you say that? Dantean.
Dantean, maybe.
Dantanian. And I guess part of it is like when you say imagination, I guess I'm trying to figure out like what do you mean by imagination? Because it you can easily say, well, I imagine unicorns and flying horses, and that's my imagination. But when you say imagination, what are you talking about?
I mean, what I'm talking about is like when Paul says, it's in First Corinthians that is it First Corinthians? Where is it? First Corinthians 9, or we were just talking about it. It's the section that we usually.
Oh, First Corinthians 10.
First Corinthians 10, yeah.
For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God,
Yeah.
for the pulling down of strongholds, casting
There
down
we go.
imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of. See, I don't have that photograph of me like you, but some things I can remember.
I was
That
off
one was
by
like
I
beating
was
to me
off
as
by
a
a
kid.
chapter.
Yeah.
So and he's trying to he says that when the gospel comes, that it didn't come as a new set of rules, but it came as an imagination forming. It reformed us at our deepest level until it reformed it towards Christ, right? So it says he casts down all of the false imaginations until our imagination is reformed towards Christ. So what we actually end up with is a well-formed or a newly formed, reformed understanding that in which the way the world is built by God seems normal, and so our gut reaction can be formed such that we respond in the way that God wants us to. We respond towards Christ. And
So
that's
can you
something
give
that,
me an
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Well,
Um,
and that's something that I think what we want to do is say, we want to say, do this, do that. You don't have to know, understand anything. Just obey, and you'll be blessed. But we don't ever want our gut reactions to be formed towards Christ. But that's what Paul says, right? Because the Pharisees and the Judaizers came in with a set of rules that said, we can reform you. Here's the set of rules. And Paul says, you know, I never worked that way. We brought every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, and your obedience was full, right? It was, your obedience was from the heart. He says he always wanted us to follow Christ heartily, or with our whole heart. In whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him, right? That it's something that everything we do, it flows from the deepest part of us, a desire to serve God. And that is actually what the preaching of the gospel does. It forms us all the way down to the bottom, and then our actions that flow out of it come from a reformed will, not a coerced will. Now, our will, discipline does coerce our will into doing the right thing.
right, like
so
training my kids. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And God does act that way, but he acts that way towards a full obedience, right? So towards an imagination that responds to reality, and sees that it's to Christ, for Christ, through Christ, everywhere. So does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't think that, I think as I'm thinking about it, I think as I think. You got me all self-conscious. I don't even want to talk a certain, I have to be comfortable because sometimes you make me nervous. Especially when you start telling me like you got to start reading dictionaries. You know, that really messed up my world. Just want you to know
Yeah,
that. You
you're
tell me, it's
welcome.
like, what did you tell me? I gotta find this. Where's my, I don't have my phone. Oh yeah, I'm gonna find it. I found my messages. Here it goes. We're gonna do this. I'm gonna come back to that point in a second, but hold on. Oh, where's the message? I'm gonna find it. I asked you something about reading dictionaries. Oh, and I gotta read your exact quote.
Nobody ever takes me seriously when I say stuff like this. This has been fun.
There it goes. Okay. I asked you, I said, I sent you a bunch of Instagram stuff for you to laugh at too, by the way. I don't know if you ever looked at that.
Oh, I did. I just wasn't going to watch any of it at the LA airport.
So why do I need to be reading a dictionary? And how do I do it? Is there a process? I did not say that at all. That's what I tried to communicate. What I wrote was, why do I need to be reading a dictionary, and how do I do it? There a process. Oh my goodness, how do you tolerate me? And, and then you said, just landed in LA. No, that's not the right one. You live in a world made of words. You think in words, which really messed me up because I was like, oh my goodness, if I'm thinking in words, that means that even my thinking is limited because I don't have enough words to think through things well. Right. So, but even you're thinking, you think in words. The use of words to create, form, and feel is central to what it means to be made in the image of God. Vocabulary is power. Vocabulary is the limit of our dominion. Head went. So, I wish I wish I would have known that 25 years ago, how much I need to be using words. I mean, you get a vocabulary, you figure it out, and then what you do is you start shifting words around to be able to try and communicate something, but then you're only shifting things around as your knowledge is growing. You're only shifting the words around trying to explain that instead of your vocabulary growing with your knowledge, right? And you're
Right,
hoping that's
right,
happening, but it's not always. And so it limits you in your ability to be able to think broadly because you don't have the words or the categories even to think that wide,
right.
you know? And so I did want to ask you, I said, well, how do you do it? And you said, pick a letter, Q, read the definition of the words that you don't know, and then note the connections you start to see. What do you mean by note the connections you start to see?
Well, so you start to realize that vocabulary is more of an interconnected web than a series of just straight definitions. Um,
Uh,
and and so a a dictionary is um, it's it's an observation of how things are used, how words are used, but there is the source of a word, there's the use of a word, and then there's the um, kind of the implications that a word brings with it, and so it's kind of a web of meaning, um, and the I mean even that this passage we were just looking at, for example, he says, you I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with the confidence wherewith I think to be bold against some, which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh, right? And he's been talking about the Judaizers that are coming in with laws and rules, and he says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal." Well, he says flesh, flesh, carnal. When you know that carnal comes from the word carne, which means meat or flesh, you know that he's saying we walk in the flesh, right? We walk in our bodies in the meat, in this meat sack, but the meat sack is not the way. Controlling the meat sack is not the way that you win this war. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. They're not focused on the body, but instead they're mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing captivity every thought. Now, he said we tear down certain thoughts, right, in certain in our imagination, and we bring into captivity every thought in our imagination towards the obedience of Christ, right? So he's actually laying down. So he's saying you don't get to. This is not an outward inward motion. It's an inward outward motion. You move from because of what's in our imagination. Um, we end
mm,
up doing the things that we end up doing, and he says we actually, the gospel that we preach pierces all the way to the reformation of the imagination, and that then our imagination is towards the obedience of Christ, right? So it's towards obeying what God calls us to do. It's not, but you can have an imagination that's against the obedience of Christ, that what God calls us to do doesn't give you, it goes against your gut. And we've all experienced this, right? I mean, I know when I was, as I was coming into the church and as a new Christian, there were all sorts of things about being a Christian that felt wrong because my imagination had
mm,
was formed into a different setting than reality. My imagination was deformed. But the more I read the scriptures, the more I spent time with Christians, the more I read church history, the more I read poetry, um, contemplated the great Christian artists, musicians, the more I saw my imagination reformed according to reality, to where obeying Christ started to seem normal, to seem the to feel right, not just be right according to kind of truth that was separated from my desires, right? So, and Augustine calls it the reformation of our desires, right? Where not the reformation, the reordering of our desires. So our desires become disordered by sin, and then by growing up apart from the Word of God, but our desires are reordered into the right order by the Scriptures, by worship, by the arts, by poetry, by good, true, right poetry. And so, and Dante, he talks about this. I mean, this is why Virgil shows up to guide Dante through hell, right? Why a poet shows up to guide him through hell, because Virgil has done so much to form his imagination. It can only take him so far before something else has to take over. But Virgil has formed his imagination towards the obedience of Christ because he's been reading Virgil in a Christian context, and the beauty and the high goodness of Virgil pointed him to the fact that there had to be a truth that made sense of the beauty and the goodness.
Is this why we need Christian art in public squares?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, because we don't have any right now. Can you think of any Christian art publicly, like that's
in America
that has this kind of imaginative? Yeah, I guess in America, I'm thinking of in America right now, that has this kind of biblical imagination that is helping form culture about the kind of world that we live in.
I think like the early Pixar movies, there were a lot of Christians involved in that early kind of golden age Pixar. And they have a positive formational effect on the imagination.
I only think we were talking about this a little bit earlier. Go ahead.
But it's so hard to come up with much. I mean, in Europe, you've still got the cathedrals there. You've still got the public art from the previous age, but we don't really have that.
I guess in one sense, does that matter if nobody knows what it means, or are those the kind of things that, because the erosion around the mind to those meaning anything, that's all.
I mean, I think it amazes me that the European education system had to work a lot harder than the American education system to undo the fact that you're surrounded by beautiful Christian art. Wow. But here's the thing, because back when I was one of the pastors of the Asian American Christian Fellowship down in California, we would have visiting students from Asia that were there to study music that would show up at church because they'd been learning Bach their whole lives and they wanted to know, and they could see. They'd show up and they'd say, I want to know where this about Christianity, because I've been studying and learning Bach my whole life and singing these or Handel, singing these Christian songs. Where are the Christians that are like Bach? And you're like, I'm sorry to say, honey, but it's still,
that's the root. Yeah,
they still wanted to. They could see. I want to understand the truth that produces this kind of beauty, because in reality, truth, beauty, and goodness are just three ways of evaluating. So they in reality they go together. We have to work really hard to pull them apart. To try and say something is beautiful that it doesn't have truth behind it or goodness behind it, is you have to work pretty hard at that.
So then, I know you got to run here soon. We got a short day today, so I want to get into this, but
I still got like 45 minutes. I think we're good.
Okay, I know, but the question I'm going to ask is going to lead to three more questions. Going to lead to three more questions, and we'll never get and maybe I just need to ask him because Jason, you're making me feel like that we're not leaving anything beautiful in our current imaginative state that is going to reflect the gospel because because it seems like that's inescapable. So then I start wondering, then what is it if we have the gospel, and I believe we do. There's no question about that. We
Right.
understand that. Where is the breakdown from us creating the kind of cathedrals and things that we need to create in our imagination? Are they not all correctly fixed? I mean, this is something that you see with C.S. Lewis. He
Yeah.
started seeing this breakdown, and this is what we've been talking about, I guess, in a lot of ways. And this is why I'm trying to read Dante, which, by the way, this is hard for me. Man, I read all
It
I
is. It's
read
hard stuff.
I read law papers, and
Hmm.
not like I understand all of them. I read affidavits. I read theonomy document. I read all kinds of stuff. Reading Dante, I feel like I don't have the right vehicle. You know, I'm like, I
Yeah.
mean, with
Well, because
most law stuff I can figure out, but Dante, I'm like, who, what?
well, legal and scientific writings, both, which are both important for in certain kind of situations, they are about making sure you're only saying one thing at a time,
Mm.
right? And so, when you get a um, a system of theology
Oh
that
my
is
goodness, I just got
a
it.
right, so when you have a
I
system
just
of
got it.
theology that is more of a legal system than a
You can't be
co-
saying multiple things at a time.
right, you have to always be saying what's the one thing, what's the one thing, set aside everything else, what's the one thing,
It can't have
right?
multiple meanings.
Can't have multiple meanings, and you end up with a belief about the world that is makes it really difficult to live in this world because it isn't like that, right? And so you are either escapist, I'll fly away, got to get out of here. You're retreatist, this world can't be reformed, it's too much, sin's too powerful. Or you basically become a fundamentalist, right? And say, well, only these things are important, though, right? Because the world is a giant, living, walking, poetic system. It you're living in.
You
Oh,
broke about it. You said only these
I'm,
things are important, though.
right. Oh, um, so you retreat away from anything that's not part of the fundamentals, right?
Essentials.
Essentials, yeah. And so and anybody that tries to say, well, hey, let's talk about something non-essential, you have to basically you have to push them away, undo them, or
Okay, wait a
so
second. Can I use myself an example of what you're talking about
sure,
here?
yeah,
So, when I became reformed, all I wanted to do was read theology. Like that was it. Like I didn't
yeah,
want if it didn't
mm-hmm.
have an exegetical extent to it, there was no place for it inside of my reading categories whatsoever. And instead of somebody coming along and said, "Hey, let me introduce you to the conversation that God has been having throughout history, along with," right? So not using this as scripture, don't understand that. Understand the fact that you have God's divine words in history is God telling the story of how he's been working. This is why we get common law. This is why it's so hard for us to embrace common law,
right,
because it's not essential. It is one of those things that Dave Fowler is probably flipping out, clapping and dancing right now. I love that guy. If nobody else listens to this podcast but Dave Fowler, I'll be happy with myself. But that's why some of the problems that we're having with embracing things like common law is because it's not an essential thing there's no exegesis to it. It's just,
yeah,
it's just there. It's been happening throughout history, but it doesn't have any value at the end of the day. But of course it does, just like American literature.
right, yeah, right, and it is it's a belief about it's a claim about reality to say here's the essentials, and that's all that's important, right? Because God didn't only give us essentials. I mean, you just look at something like the vegetables, right? He could have just grown one single vegetable that is all of the things that we need in it, but he didn't. Right? He decided that he wanted us to figure out how to make all different kinds of salads with all different kinds of vegetables. Right? That was his idea, to fill the world with all the different sights, sounds, colors, tastes. And there are things that when you're young, you don't, you young palates are like, ooh, onions. I don't want that. But then as you grow and you get older, there's a historical element even to taste buds and the way those work. And so I think there's this, the world that God created is this living art piece. And we say, well, I just want to get down to the essential ideas.
Blue, green, red, orange. He used those colors.
Yeah.
Those are nice. All right. Okay, so Jason, so then because the reason is, and we talked about this before in another show, and this is really helping me here. It's going to take all of that to point to something. It's going to take all of that to point to the internality, the beauty of God at the end of the day. It's going to take all those different seasonings. It's going to take those different vegetables. It's going to take those different flavors. It's going to take those different sugars. It's going to take all of that to communicate something about who God is.
Right. Because he said, here's the image of God. Right. Adam and Eve are Adam is the image of God. Eve is the image of God. Adam and Eve together are the image of God. And then the human race as a whole, all throughout history, is the image of God. Because God is eternal, infinite, all-knowing, all-wise, all of these things that God is trying to image into the world, or that not God is trying. God is imaging into the world through us. But me, as I am fully and completely the image of God, but there's not enough of me or enough time in my life to display God, right? It takes the entire human race to do that. And so it takes the entire human race over the entire course of history to do that. And we won't even finish, right? So it's an eternal process. Right? So the image of God, we always are trying to get it down to its essence. What is the essential things that make us into the image of God, rather than saying, oh my gosh, all this is the image of God. This is what it takes. So piling on all of the different things about humanity is a way of saying, okay, there's more to learn about God over here, more to learn about God. You don't exhaust your knowledge of God ever. And even throughout all eternity, no one will exhaust the knowledge of God. The knowledge of God is infinite, and we're finite. And so all of eternity is going to be the process of us continuing to learn about who God is, and so that we can glorify him better and better and better. We can worship him more fully, more truly, better and better. And that's what the Spirit is doing in history. He is building a bride to worship, building a bride, building a nation, building a community, building a race of people that can worship God into eternity. And we have a tendency to say, I want to boil it down. Let's just boil it down. And then we don't produce art, because art is not about boiling it down. Art is about putting on display the connections.
Okay, so we can keep going down this art road, because now I want to know. So then help me. Let's do this, because I think that when I hear Christian artists, or anybody who's an artist, they seem to be disconnected from a robust theological foundation. Most of them are ignorant, right? Like they just don't have it. And so you have this art that you're like, there is no theology there at all.
Right.
It's just dumb.
In the modern present. Yeah.
Yes. Like with Dante, he's on some other stuff. So
He's
How
basically the most educated person of his day. And his goal was to be a politician that really blessed his city.
he
And then
failed at that though, didn't he?
he got exiled.
Ah.
Right? He got exiled. And so he was a poet and he was writing poetry, but his poetry didn't, it really took on the spiritual character that it has because of his exile, because he came to realize I was thinking too small by saying, okay, God, what can I do for Florence? Really, I should be saying, okay, Lord, what have you got me to do? What am I here to do for your people as a whole, for the human race in the world? And so God had to get him into exile to change to widen his vision. Same thing happened to John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, probably the greatest epic in English. Although Beowulf is up there too. But John Milton, he had to go blind before he could become somebody that could see well enough to be able to write Paradise Lost. So God has this way of squeezing out of us the small visions that we have in order to get us to the place that he wants us, which is to think kingdom.
Okay. So I don't want to interrupt. That's a good line. To think kingdom, what?
Just to think in terms of how do I benefit the king, benefit the king, expand his kingdom, serve him well in whatever situation he puts us in, right? I mean, very few people end up a Dante, a Milton, a world former, a world turner, somebody that actually causes the world to turn a little bit more to the right to stay on the path, or to get back on the path.
Well, see, that's the thing. This is something that's been hitting me, Jason, is that I have 7 souls that I lord over in my house. I got 7 worlds to inspire to think magnificently about God's world.
Right.
And so that is my responsibility, my obligation that God has given me in the way that I love my neighbor, is making children, giving children the type of education that sees the world in the true biblical imagination, that they can help transform in whatever they do, right? And so that they can impact the world that way. So in one sense, like, yeah, you're right. We don't get to, I'm not probably going to be a Dante ever, but the way that I get to affect these 7 folks, 8, including my wife, has that kind of world impact ultimately.
It
and
does.
If we all kind of come together around that, and we look at our world or our universe in our homes, there isn't a more important, impactful place to be. And that's why this is so important. Okay, so I want to jump into, because here's the deal. So Dante, were you going to say something about that? I don't want to interrupt you.
Well, just that, and at the heart of it is teaching your kids to embrace the world God made with joy, right? Because the joy of the Lord is our strength. And if an education doesn't lead to wisdom, which is the ability to live well in the world God made, right? To embrace the world the way God made it, enjoy it, and you leave it better than you found it, then there's very little strength that if you don't have joy, there's very little strength left, right? That's the heart of the strength of the church, of Christians.
So I'm having a problem trying to read through Dante and understand it. And so then I feel like that I am exactly the person you're talking about, who has this imagination that is not been transformed. Do not be conformed to this world, brother, but be transformed by the renewal of,
yeah.
Right. And so as I'm reading through Dante, and I told you, I finished the introduction, and that was like, it was work. And Canto
1, yeah.
I'm at Canto 3, actually. I told you 2, but I was actually 3, and I read Canto 3. And here's what's weird. I've learned with some books that I don't understand, I've learned to keep reading until I
Hmm.
feel, and I struggle and I wrestle with the author until I understand the author. And somewhere in Canto 3, I felt like I was with the author. And so I wanted
Yeah.
to go back and start reading the author again. But I don't, you're telling me that the more that I understand Dante, the better that I understand the type of world that we live in. Okay, let's just Canto 2.
Okay.
Can you break that
Yeah.
down? Like, how
Yep.
is this transformative to my imagination? you know, um, and I get nobody. Everybody's like, "What? I haven't read Dante. You guys didn't tell me we're reading Dante." Um, yeah, surprise.
Well, there's it's a really you you
And
have to
maybe
assume
can
reading
let me
Dante. Yeah, go ahead.
let me say this real quick. And maybe you can help me with. And we have conversations. We've had conversations, but more help with thinking poetically because there is another muscle that's not working there in order to be able to read Dante. I feel like I'm in a different car, right? Um, so I can see one thing and I'm like, is he talking about this? And it's like, well, you need to have broader, which is why again, the beginner's guide to Dante, Divine Comedy by Jason Baxter is helpful. It's very
Really
helpful.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
So because what Dante does so well is he pulls things together and shows the similarities between things, and that's where a lot of the wisdom of what Dante brings is teaching us to see the patterns, teaching us to see the patterns that are a part of the way God has built the world, right? See the patterns and
Okay.
similarities, because uh, in Dante's understanding, and really in that um, medieval Christian understanding, the world is a work of art, and so it's and art is a way of putting on display the truth through the beauty and the goodness of the truth,
Mm,
or putting on display goodness through the beauty and the truth of goodness, right? So pulling together, pulling into the conversation truth via beauty or goodness, pulling into the conversation goodness through beauty and truth, right? So trying to show how to, and in that way, it forms our desires towards what's good. It forms our desires towards truth because it shows that it's beautiful. This is, I mean, advertisers get this and they use it against us all the time. Right? You put beautiful people sitting around drinking Bud Light, and you think, Bud Light must be good, right? No, it's
hmm
not. Bud Light is terrible. It's like bad water. Um, it's water. If water could spoil, it's not even good beer, right? But the advertisers get that beautiful people sitting around holding it is an argument, right? It's an argument that what you have is something good. But what Dante is doing, and what the poets throughout history that hang around and continue to resonate are those are the ones that actually pulled real truth and goodness together and showed that it's beautiful. And here, the thing in chapter or in Canto 2 that he's after is courage, right?
mm.
He wants to put on display the beauty of courage. So that's and so day was departing and the dusk drew on, loosing from labor every living thing. Save me in all the world. I alone must gird me to the wars. Rough traveling, and pity's sharp assault upon the heart, which memory shall record unfaltering. Now, muses, now, high genius, do your part. So he says, sun's going down. It's Good Friday. He's been walking all day Good Friday because Canto 1 set you up that it's Good Friday, and finds himself in the middle of his life on a deep, dark wood. And Virgil comes and says, come this way. I'm going to show you the entrance to your journey. And so they've been walking all day because now it's dusk. And he's saying, I'm trying to gird myself up for this battle, but it's rough rough traveling is making it hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
But he says, now muses, now high genius, do your part. So this is an old way of calling upon. So the muses were in old mythology, the muses were the ones that inspired the different arts. And so he says, what do I need? I need encouragement. I need to be shown the beauty of keeping courage, right? Because I'm losing courage. And so he calls upon the muses and the high genius. And we've talked a little bit about the word genius. That word is in the middle of changing its meaning. So that's why in this translation, it's still capitalized because it's a proper noun. But he's taking the genius and the muses and pushing them together so that he needs help beyond himself.
What is that? Remind me of genius again. Like, so genius.
So in the ancient world, the genius was the spiritual being that was behind the power, the civil
right,
power.
like a genie. Yeah,
right?
like
a genie. Yeah.
Right. We talked about that in the lunar stuff.
Right. Yeah. But he is saying that it's not. So what he does is he says the muses and the genius can speak poetically now through me, or show me something poetic, so that my courage returns, because he's losing his courage. He's going into a spiritual battle, but he's beginning to lose courage already. But the fact that he says, high genius, come to me, when he doesn't have any political authority, shows that shifting understanding of the political authorities as a completely different kind of person, right? Higher on the chain of being. Well, the genius can come to anyone. It doesn't just come, it doesn't just come to the authorities and the powers. But what does it do? Well, it shows us the beauty of goodness, so he will want to do it. And he says, and memory, come to me, faithful scrivener, which means author, writer, to the eyes. Here, show thy virtue, noble as thou art. So he says, I need some stories from the past. I need to remember what God has done in the past. Remember stories from the past. I need poetic power, to see the beauty of keeping courage. And I soon began, poet, dear guide, 'twere wise surely to test my powers and weigh their worth ere trusting me to this great enterprise. Right. So he says, Virgil's the poet, his guide. He says, okay, I get it. You're testing me before you send me on this great mission. Thou sayest the author of young Silvius's birth did to the world immortal mortal go, clothed in the body of flesh he wore on earth. So he says, okay, I'm remembering your poem. So now he's referencing Virgil's poem, the Aeneid. Aeneas went into hell in the sixth book, I think, because it's 12. There's 12 books in the Aeneid. The sixth book, right in the middle, Aeneas goes into hell and visits with his father, who has died, and because he has lost his mission. He was on a mission. He was sent to go found Rome when Troy fell, and he's off, and he gets distracted from his mission. And he's told, go over here, go down into hell, and you'll be reminded of your mission. And so he goes down into Hades to see his father. But he went in his body, right? Most people go into Hades by dying, but he went clothed in the flesh he wore on earth. Granted, if hell's great foeman deigned to show to him such favor, seeing the vast effect and what and who his destined issue know, that need surprise no thoughtful intellect, since to Rome's fostering city an empery, or the founding of the empire, high heaven had sealed him as the father elect. Right, so he had lost his mission. That he was the one that heaven had sealed him, had elected him, had chosen him to go be the father of the empire of Rome, be the first emperor of Rome. But he had forgotten it, and so he was sent to hell to be reminded of the mission that he was supposed to be on, that heaven had sent him on. Right, Dante is saying, okay, wait, think I'm getting it. Virgil,
Uh,
you've come to lead me, to put me back on the mission that I've forgotten. In the middle of his life, Virgil comes to him in a dark wood, and this is all a fantasy story, until the third book becomes a science fiction story. But it's fantasy, science fiction. But he says, why is it that Virgil would come to me? Well, I can see in the poem that Virgil wrote the shape that God must be using with me. Why? So now remember, he has been exiled. His real life, he's going through the hell of exile. He has been sent away. And so he's reflecting on it. How does my story fit into the story of humanity? That's a poetic question. How can my exile become a benefit to the rest of humanity if I can figure out the pattern and communicate beautifully the pattern that God has used in me? But that's going to mean I have to take courage and war this spiritual warfare through my exile. And so he's poetically trying to understand his own story and communicate the beauty of it so that he can then be a benefit to other people, that his life can benefit other people. He's realized that God is whacking him in the side of his head with this exile to get him back on the mission, the same way Aeneas went through hell to get back on the mission to found Rome. And he said this shouldn't surprise anyone that thinks, he said it should be no surprise to thoughtful intellect. He says, but both these were there established verily to found that place holy and dedicate, wherein great Peter's heir should hold his see. Right? So he says, because even Aeneas founding Rome was a part of God's plan. Because eventually Peter would become the bishop of Rome. Right? So when you look at the history of Rome, even the pagan part of Rome was a part of God's plan to build a city and an empire through which the gospel could then spread to the world. So no matter what Aeneas thought he was doing it for, God had a plan for the founding of Rome, so that the deed thy verses celebrate taught him the road to victory and bestowed the papal mantle in its high estate. Right? So Aeneas travels from Troy to found Rome. He has to go through this process of going through hell to be reminded that heaven has sent him on a mission. And the way that he's reminded is he goes down, he sees his father. His father says to him, remember what you were called to do? You keep getting distracted. Let me show you the future. Right? He shows him, he gives him a vision of what Rome will become, and then that pushes him back onto his mission. So it's a backward facing and a forward facing imagination that can actually accomplish the mission that is given to him. And he says, thither or to there, the chosen vessel in like mode went afterwards, and much confirmed thereby the faith that sets us on salvation's road. So he says the same way that Virgil set up a shape for the life of Aeneas actually turns out to be something that we as Christians go through, and remembering that keeps us on the road that God has us for, right? Remembering that if God sends us in exile, puts us through something that feels hellish, it's because he is trying to keep us on the road or put us on the road or press us back into the mission that he has for us. But then he says, but how should I go there? Who says so? Why? I'm not Aeneas. He says, I am not Paul, which is a really interesting thing to say, except for, what is it, 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul tells us about the time he visited the third heavens.
Yeah.
Right. So
right.
Yeah. So he says, I'm not Aeneas. I'm not Paul. Who thinks me fit? Not others, not I. He says, why would I be the one? Right?
Why me, Lord?
Why me, Lord? Right?
Yeah.
He says, say I submit and go. Suppose I fall into some folly. Though I speak but ill, thy better wisdom will construe it all. Right? He says, what if I go and fail? So, and as one who wills, and then so then that's the end of his speech to, you can see the punctuation shows that it's the end of his speech to Virgil. He says, and then he says, as one who wills and then unwills his will, changing his mind with every changing whim, till all his best intentions come to nil. So I stood havering in that moorland dim, while through fond rifts of fancy oozed away the first quick zest that filled me to the brim. Now, havering, if you've ever heard the song, I will walk 10,000 miles, I would walk 10,000 more.
10,000 more. Yeah.
That's the only other place I've ever heard the word havering is in that song. It's just so, yeah, and it just means, well, that's a good one to go look up, right? You see a word and you say, I don't know what havering is. You can go look it up. And so at the first quick zest that filled me to the brim. So he says, I was really excited at the beginning of the day, but now I've been walking in a dark wood all day long. The sun's going down. He says, and my zeal is starting to fade. That's his interpretation of what's going on. And this is what makes Dante so great. He says, if I have grasped what this is now Virgil responds. If I have grasped what thou dost seem to say, the shade of greatness answered, these doubts breed from sheer black cowardice. Virgil says, you're lying to yourself. Straight to his face, you're lying to yourself. It sounded really great when he says, who am I, Lord? I don't think I'm not the right one. Right, it sounds humble. Oh. And Virgil just says, you're lying to yourself. So for a long time, these doubts breed from sheer black cowardice. I had printed out and hanging on my wall, right? That because there's so many ways that we want to say, oh, I don't know, Lord, I want to be humble, I don't want to be prideful, but it's actually a cover for cowardice. Right. We're actually trying to cover the fact that we're just being cowards. Now, the way
I hate you right now.
Right. But the way that he sets you up for that stab between the ribs is you're nodding along with Dante. Right?
You understand Dante. You feel Dante.
I've said that stuff. I can see, like, okay, I get it. And Virgil looks at him and just says, you're being a coward, right? That's what we're really dealing with. You don't want to tackle
the hard work,
the hard work of your own spiritual life. You don't want to tackle the hard work of digging in and letting the Spirit of God transform you, right? You don't want to tackle it, and so he says. But then he says, the sheer black cowardice which day by day lays ambushes for men, checking the speed of honorable purpose in mid-flight, as shapes half seen startle a shying steed, right? And so he says, the way that a horse jumps at a shadow, he says, that's what's going on. There's nothing real about your objections. Right. The way that you're telling your own story right now is actually the thing getting in the way of you being able to just do the mission that God has put before you. It's beautiful. So then he says,
I don't like Dante.
To rid thee of this foolish fright, hear why I came, and learn whose eloquence urged me to take compassion on thy plight. While I was with the spirits who dwell suspense, a lady summoned me to bless, so blessed, so rare, I begged her to command my diligence. Her eyes outshone the firmament by far, as she began in her own gracious tongue, gentle and low, as tongues of angels are. O courteous Mantuan soul. Virgil was born in Mantua, whose skill in song keeps green on earth a fame that shall not end while motion rolls the turning spheres along. A friend of mine, who is not fortune's friend, is hard beset upon the shadowy coast. Terrors and snares his fearful steps attend, driving him back. Yea, I fear almost I have risen too late to help, for I was told such news of him in heaven he's too far lost. But thou, go thou, lift up thy voice of gold, try every needful means to find and reach and free him, that my heart may rest consoled. Beatrice am I, who thy good speed beseech. Love that first moved me from the blissful place whither I'd fain return, now moves my speech. He says, you remember Beatrice? Now, Beatrice is dead at this point when Dante's writing this.
Yeah.
He says, you remember Beatrice? Do you remember the way God first called you to himself through the beauty of Beatrice? You know, she's up there in heaven, right? More beautiful than she ever was here on earth. You remember all that? Right. So he's asked memory to come to him to remind him to go to continue on the path. And Virgil says, let me remind you of the first beauty that you remember that you know you couldn't have created. The first
there has to be a God. Look at that woman.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so, Virgil is reminding him of his first encounter with the Lord, which was through the beauty of Beatrice, and then basically calling him on to leave his cowardice behind and be inspired back to a chivalrous mindset that says, charge, that says, oh, here comes the conflict, charge. So Saint Boniface does that. Beauty does that, right? Saint Boniface says, listen for the roar of the lion. That's where the fight is won. When you hear the roar of the lion, charge that direction. He's training preachers, right? That's in his book to preachers, right? Right. That there's a courage that's always needed, and that what is the thing? One of the central things that God has given to the world to make men courageous is beauty. And when we want to turn away from beauty, deny the reality of beauty, say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder and is not a reality that we are experiencing, we get men that aren't courageous anymore.
How that's all we've been taught is that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It doesn't have any objective standard.
Right. That's not actually what Shakespeare meant when he wrote that in context, but that's a whole different thing, because we are taught that beauty is something that I add through my mind, through my interpretation. It's not something that is objective that we experience.
That acts on us.
Right?
Right.
And so we have purposefully, as a culture, we have dulled our senses to stop responding to beauty. Right. And in the church, what we've often said is beauty is lying to you. Beauty is lying to you, right? The world is a harsh place. It's a dark place, and beauty comes along and tries to tempt you away. But stay strong, ignore all the beauty, follow Jesus instead, rather than saying, we've actually got the best story. We've got the most beautiful Savior. We have the most glorious Lord. We have the best covenant, the greatest law. We have the best way of building community, loving one another, the best music, the best art, we got the best man, the best women.
We don't want to talk like that. We don't want to talk like that, do we? Right. We don't want to say we've got the best man. Oh, shut up.
Because of the black cowardice. Yeah, it's dangerous reading Dante, because he messes with you.
Yeah, but I read Dante. I didn't get that. So now the thing that bothers me as we were going through this and you're working through this, like I don't have the faculties to be able to read Dante yet. And so this might just become a whole show about reading Dante. Because I'm serious though, in one sense, because everything you just said here and reading this, I've read through this. Man, there's on YouTube, there is a video that has Dorothy Sayers' version. The guy was really brilliant because he had little hand puppets to make it look like to get around the copyright. It's really brilliant. And so he does 10-minute versions of this where he goes through Canto 1, Canto 2, and Canto, and he goes through all of them. They're like 10 to 12 minutes. So I listened to this, I read this, but I wasn't able to poetically break all this down. You know, I wasn't able to break it down or have the understanding even to be able to get, how do I get that? How do I start operating in small ways, being able to absorb that? Because I felt like now I was able to absorb that in a way because of the way you're breaking it down. I'm like, oh, wow. Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the great things that we have right now is there's a lot of resources out there. I think we should try and talk to Jason Baxter. I think that'd be really fun. See if we
gotta get him on.
Pull him in. Yeah.
Can we do this again? I know you got to run.
Yeah. No, let's do it again. Should we just do Canto 3 next?
Yeah, I'm gonna read some Baxter too in this book, The Beginner's Guide to Dante's Divine Comedy. I think so. I think let's keep going because I think we're going to connect metaphysics, cosmology, and Gnosticism all together in this. I think that all of that is going to connect in here because I'm looking at the things that's happened in the last year and saying, man, we were cowards.
Yep.
Right. We were cowards. And why were we
black cowardice? And we're surrounded by it. Well, Dante, he's got a theory. He says it's because we've closed our eyes to the beauty that God has surrounded us with. So we don't think there's anything worth defending. And so we go limp.
Until next time, I guess. All right. So I'm going to read Canto 3 and maybe give me some parameters or something that can help me think through. Should I just use Jason Baxter's to kind of go along with this so I can kind of come more prepared with some questions even for myself? And man, that was good, Jason. Doggone it, that was good. Would that be the best thing? The Beginner's Guide to Dante's Divine Comedy?
I think so. Baxter? I mean, I'm reading through it right now and really, really benefiting from it a lot.
So I mean,
between that and the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis, I think.
Yeah, we got everything. Jason Baxter.
Yep.
Okay, I'll go through 3. We'll start working through 3, and I'm gonna, because here's what I think you've done with this. Some people say, well, poetry, you can't ever lock anything down. You can't lock it in. That's the problem with poetry. Well, that locked it in pretty good. And I want to know how to do that. So I think the poetry is for grown folks. I guess I'm about to grow up. So that's really good, man.
Awesome.
Go do your meeting, man.
All right.
That's fine.
See you.
I'll talk to you later.
We'll talk. All right. Sounds good.